A few summers ago, I went on a beach vacation with a couple of friends. We were looking for a break from our everyday lives, hoping to soak up the sun, swim in the ocean, and just relax. We rented a small beach house on a secluded stretch of coastline. No resorts, no big crowds, just us and the sea. It sounded perfect. The beach was gorgeous. The sand was soft and pale, the water clear and inviting. The first few days were everything we'd hoped for. Bonfires at night, lazy swims during the day, and endless hours of lounging under the sun. Felt like paradise, at least at first. But there was one part of the beach that stood out, a section down the shoreline where no one ever went. It was rocky, and the water there seemed darker, colder. The locals didn't talk about it much, but every now and then, we'd catch them glancing at it. Like there was something about that spot they didn't want to acknowledge. One evening, after a few drinks around the fire, we decided to explore that part of the beach, just for fun. We'd heard stories from some of the older residents about shipwrecks in that area, and we thought it might be cool to check it out. We had no idea what we were walking into. As we got closer to the rocky stretch, the air felt colder, despite the warm summer evening. The crashing of the waves seemed louder there, more violent, as if the ocean itself was angry. The sand was wet and dark, the rocks slick with seaweed. It wasn't the friendly, welcoming beach we had grown used to. Something felt wrong. We joked around to keep the mood light, but the further we walked, the more uneasy I became. The others must have felt it too because we stopped talking altogether, just moving silently toward the dark water. That's when we saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the surf. At first, I thought it was just another beachgoer, someone else who had wandered down here to explore. But as we got closer, the figure didn't move. It was tall and slender, standing impossibly still, facing the ocean. We called out, but it didn't respond. Then it started walking slowly, deliberately into the water. I'm not sure what made me do it, but I followed. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I just wanted to see if they needed help. My friends stayed behind, calling after me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing me toward that figure, pulling me closer. As I stepped into the water, the temperature plummeted. It wasn't just cold, it was freezing, like stepping into the dead of winter. The waves lapped around my ankles, but it didn't feel like normal water. It felt thick, heavy, as though it was trying to drag me under. The figure was now waist deep, moving further out, and I could see something strange. Its legs weren't walking through the water. They were barely touching the surface, like it was floating. That's when I saw the faces. In the waves, in the shifting currents, faces appeared. Pale, distorted, mouths open in silent screams. They would emerge for a moment and then vanish back into the water. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw one face too clearly. A young woman, her hair swirling around her as though she were trapped beneath the surface, her eyes wide with terror. I froze, my feet sinking into the cold sand. The figure was almost completely submerged now, and the faces in the water were multiplying. They circled the figure, their eyes locking onto me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the ocean. Time seemed to stretch, the sounds of the waves and the wind growing distant. The faces in the water began to rise higher, their hands reaching out toward me from beneath the surface. I could feel the pull of the tide, stronger than it should have been, like invisible hands grabbing my legs, trying to drag me in. Suddenly, I heard my friends yelling, their voices cutting through the strange silence. One of them grabbed my arm, yanking me back toward the shore. As soon as I was out of the water, the spell broke. The freezing cold disappeared, the water returning to its normal temperature. But when I looked back, the figure was gone. So were the faces. We ran back to the beach house without saying a word. I could feel the ocean behind me, like it was still watching, waiting for me to return. That night, none of us slept. We didn't talk about what happened, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They had seen something too. The next morning, we packed up and left. We didn't finish the week. We didn't even say goodbye to the locals. I never went back to that beach, and I never looked for any explanation. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see those faces in the water. I still feel that pull, the cold, dead grip of the ocean that never truly let me go. I survived, but something stayed with me. And I know now, there are things in the water, things that wait beneath the surface, things that you don't want to disturb. I've always been drawn to the beach. There's something calming about the sound of the waves, the salt in the air, the endless horizon stretching out before you. For me, it's a place of peace, a place to escape from the chaos of the world. Last summer, I decided to take a solo trip to a remote beach I'd heard about through some friends. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find on a tourist map. It was a small, secluded spot, hidden away behind rocky cliffs and dense foliage, accessible only by foot, perfect for a bit of solitude. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to set. The beach was as beautiful as I'd imagined, empty, untouched by people, with smooth white sand and crystal clear water. I set up my towel, eager to spend the evening watching the sunset in perfect peace. That's when I found it. While walking along the shore, I spotted something glimmering in the sand. At first, I thought it was just another seashell, but as I got closer, I realized it was different. It was a spiral shell, larger than any I'd ever seen, with intricate patterns etched into its surface. It almost looked like someone had carved them by hand, but the design was far too delicate, too perfect. I picked it up, feeling its cool, smooth surface. There was something mesmerizing about it, something that made it hard to look away. I turned it over in my hands, marveling at its beauty. But as soon as I pressed it against my ear, hoping to hear the sound of the ocean, I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my head. It was brief, like a lightning strike, and then it was gone. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just some random ache. But I noticed that the beach had grown eerily quiet. The sound of the waves had faded, replaced by a low, distant hum. I put the shell in my bag, thinking nothing more of it, and went back to my spot. But as the sun set, the beach began to change. I watched the sky turn from orange to deep red, then to purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air grew cooler, and a thick fog rolled in from the sea, blanketing the beach in an unsettling, misty shroud. That's when I noticed the tide. It had come in faster than usual, swallowing the shoreline in minutes. The waves were more violent now, crashing against the rocks with a force that seemed unnatural. The peaceful, tranquil beach had transformed into something dark and menacing. And then I saw them, figures shadowy and indistinct, moving within the fog. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as the mist thickened, the figures became more defined. There were 5, maybe 6 of them, walking slowly toward the water's edge. Their movements were strange, jerky, like they weren't quite human. I tried to convince myself it was just other people enjoying a foggy beach. But as I watched them, I realized they weren't walking on the beach. They were walking in the water, submerged up to their knees, but moving effortlessly, as if the waves didn't affect them at all. I called out, but they didn't respond. Instead, they stopped and turned toward me. A sense of dread washed over me as the figures stood there, unmoving, staring in my direction. I couldn't see their faces, only the vague outlines of their bodies through the fog. The air around me felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. I felt cold, even though the air had been warm just moments before. I looked down at the shell in my bag, and that's when the whispers started. They were faint at first, just barely audible, like a breeze brushing past my ears. But the longer I held the shell, the louder they became. They weren't in any language I understood, just a series of low, guttural sounds that filled my head with an overwhelming sense of unease. I dropped the shell onto the sand, my heart racing. The whispers stopped, but the figures in the water started moving again. This time, toward me. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my bag and started to run, but the thick sand and the weight of the air slowed me down. The figures moved faster, gliding through the water, closing the distance between us. I didn't dare look back. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat and the crashing of the violent waves. I ran until my legs burned, But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the whispers. They were inside my head now, growing louder with every step, echoing from the shell that I had left behind. By the time I made it back to my car, I was shaking. The beach was far behind me, but I could still feel the presence of those figures, still hear the faintest trace of the whispers. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, that I had just been spooked by the fog and the eerie atmosphere, but something told me it was more than that. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The shell's image burned into my mind. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those figures in the water, heard the whispers calling to me. When I finally drifted off in the early hours of the morning, I dreamt of the beach. In the dream, I was standing at the water's edge, the shell in my hand, and the figures were surrounding me, their faces still hidden by the fog. The next morning, I found sand in my bed, and on my nightstand, impossibly, the shell. I don't know how it got there. I left it on the beach, I'm sure of it. But there it was, as perfect and beautiful as before, waiting for me. I threw it into the ocean later that day, far from where I live now. But sometimes, when I walk near the shore, I still hear the whispers on the wind, faint and distant, like they're trying to find me. And I know one day they will. It was a spontaneous trip, something my friends and I planned one summer after weeks of hearing rumors about the abandoned cove down the coastline. Everyone called it the Drowned Cove, a place shrouded in local superstition. The story went that in the 1800s, a group of fishermen disappeared there after a terrible storm. Their bodies never recovered. Locals said you could hear their voices in the waves if you visited at night. Most people avoided the place, but we thought it sounded like the perfect adventure. There were 5 of us, all looking for something thrilling, something to break up the monotony of the summer. We set out in the late afternoon, hiking along the cliffs that overlooked the sea until we reached the cove. It was hidden, tucked away behind jagged rocks and a dense line of trees. By the time we arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the water. The cove was eerily quiet. No seabirds, no wind, just the gentle sound of the waves lapping against the shore. The water was a strange color, darker than the open sea. Still, we set up camp, eager to spend the night and see if we could hear the so-called drowned song. As night fell, the atmosphere shifted. The waves grew louder, almost rhythmic, like they were echoing a slow, mournful melody. At first, we laughed it off. Must be the acoustics of the cove, someone said. But the longer we listened, the more unsettling it became. That's when we heard it. Not just the waves' voices, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind, rising and falling with the surf. We thought it was just a trick of the wind. Maybe the shape of the cove made it sound like someone was singing. But as we sat around the campfire, the voices grew clearer. They weren't just random sounds anymore. They were actual words, though none of us could understand them. It was like listening to a song in a foreign language, haunting and distant. One of my friends, Derek, got up. He was always the bravest of us, the one who pushed things just a little too far. He grabbed a flashlight and walked toward the water, saying he wanted to get a better listen. We watched him go, the beam of his light bouncing off the dark waves. He stood at the edge of the surf for what felt like forever, just staring out at the water, the voices still echoing around us. Then, without warning, he stepped into the water. We yelled at him to come back, but he didn't respond. He just kept walking deeper, as if in a trance. The water quickly rose to his knees, then his waist. The flashlight flickered, casting weird shadows on the beach, and then he was gone. The water swallowed him whole. Panic erupted. We rushed to the shore, but there was no sign of him. No splash, no struggle, nothing. Just silence and the soft, eerie melody of the voices. The cove had taken him. We called out for Derek, screaming his name into the night. One of us even waded into the water, but it was like he had disappeared completely. There were no waves, no disturbance in the water, just that strange, unnatural calm. The voices, though, they were louder now, almost as if they were coming from beneath the surface. We ran back to camp, grabbed our phones, but of course, there was no signal. The cove was isolated, cut off from the rest of the world. We were alone, but even as we frantically tried to think of what to do, something strange started happening. One by one, we began hearing our names in the voices. At first, it was faint, just a whisper among the melody. But then it became clearer, calling to us, luring us toward the water. The others were terrified, but something in me, something deep down, wanted to go to the water. It felt like the voices were speaking to me directly, not just calling my name, but inviting me. I could feel the pull, like invisible hands guiding me toward the ocean. I almost gave in. I almost stepped into the water just like Derek had. But something snapped me out of it. Maybe it was the sound of one of my friends crying, or maybe it was just sheer survival instinct. I don't know, but I pulled myself back from the edge. Instead, we grabbed whatever we could carry and ran. We left everything behind. The tent, the fire, the bags, and sprinted through the trees, not stopping until we reached the cliffs where we'd come from. The voices followed us, echoing through the night, growing fainter with every step. When we finally made it back to town, we reported Derek missing. The police searched the cove the next morning, but they found no trace of him. No footprints, no clothes, no sign that he had ever been there. The locals didn't seem surprised. They told us that every few years, someone would disappear from the cove. Sometimes it was tourists, sometimes it was locals, but it always happened the same way. They'd hear the voices, go into the water, and never come back. I've never been back to that beach, and I never will. I still hear the song sometimes, though, late at night when I'm lying in bed with the window open, the sound of the waves carrying something far more sinister than just the ocean breeze. The cove is still out there, waiting for the next person to listen too closely, waiting for the next one to drown.